Newport, Rhode Island is celebrated today for its remaining Gilded Age cottages, opulent estates that once housed some of America's wealthiest families during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Names like the Vanderbilt, Astor, and Berwind families come to mind, conjuring images of lavish balls, sweeping seaside views, and meticulously manicured lawns. Yet for every grand villa still standing in Newport, there are others that have been lost to time, leaving behind only faded photographs and traces in local lore. Hi everyone, Ken here. Today we are exploring the lost mansions of Newport, Rhode Island. Hit that subscribe button and let's dive into an extra special episode of This House. In the late 1800s, Newport transformed from a quiet coastal town into a summer playground for industrialists, bankers, and socialites. These visitors built what they fondly called summer cottages, an understatement that belied the palatial size and sophisticated architectural styles of these estates. Architects from Europe and New York descended upon Newport to design residences that rivaled the grand palaces of the Old World. Ornate ballrooms, gilded dining halls, and sprawling gardens became emblematic of a new American aristocracy seeking to display its wealth and status. Many of these estates that endure, such as the Breakers, Marble House, and the Elms, have been lovingly preserved and are open for public tours, offering glimpses of this bygone era. However, an equally intriguing story lies in the mansions that were lost over time. Some were demolished during economic downturns when the families that owned them could no longer afford their upkeep. Others fell victim to fires or were repurposed for modern developments, their sprawling lawns partitioned into smaller parcels to accommodate the changing landscape of Newport's real estate. We are about to see more mansions than you could ever have imagined being lost in an area known for its outstanding preservation. As we go through them, let me know which ones are your favorite, and without further ado, we'll start off at Armsea Hall, the summer home of General Francis Fenton Green on Ocean Avenue. Completed in 1901, this grand estate was designed by the esteemed architecture firm of Hopper & Cohen to look over an expansive lawn leading to the sea. A great place for us to start, as it sets the tone, with marble balustrade lining the outlook where the wealthy race their sailboats. For as idyllic as the setting may be, the house itself was designed to rival the natural beauty of the area. Entering the mansion, we arrive in the stair hall, with walls clad in intricately carved paneling and crowned by ornate plasterwork soaring overhead. Spanning the entire width of the southern wing, we find the living room finished out in a deep red, with creamy off-white painted woodwork. Though small by comparison, the otherwise sizable rooms were all finished out with the utmost attention to detail. As time went on and the house changed hands, it saw only the newest and most fashionable furniture being brought into it with each new owner. Sadly, this grand estate was demolished in 1969 to make way for new development. Though Armsea Hall may have been short-lived, other mansions did not have the luxury of being passed from one owner to the next. Newport was the playground of the wealthiest people in America, and it was quickly running out of developable space along the coastline. The homes that weren't big enough nor palatial enough soon found themselves torn down to make way for homes that would fit the standards of the upper echelons, such as Belvoir. It was purchased by Arthur Curtis James, who had been born into immense wealth. His grandfather, Daniel James, helped establish Phelps Dodge & Company, and his father later transformed the firm into one of the world's largest copper refineries. Thanks to his shrewd railroad investments, eventually claiming ownership of 1/7 of the nation's rail lines, Arthur quietly multiplied his fortune to become one of the 10 richest Americans of his time. While his wife, Harriet Eddy Parsons, who was nicknamed Lady Sapphira for her jewel-encrusted gowns, enjoyed the social scene and lavish entertainments, Arthur preferred to keep a low profile, preserving both his privacy and the mystery of his wealth. In place of Belvoir, he built Beacon Hill House, which stood out for its sweeping, elevated views and forward-thinking design. Conceived in 1901 as a birthday cottage for Harriet, Beacon Hill House boasted modern features like removable walls, allowing rooms to expand when hosting large soirees, and elegant, classically inspired interiors. It was finished out with rich woodwork, taking artisans years to complete. Beyond the interior, formal gardens adorned with fountains and neoclassical columns surrounded the mansion, while a private village just for James to enjoy was constructed and staffed so he wouldn't have to leave his property and mingle amongst the general public. While the village has survived, the mansion itself only stood until 1966 when fire engulfed it. On a more positive note, you may be familiar with the Breakers, Newport's largest cottage, which was constructed by the Vanderbilt family. But did you know that the exact spot where this esteemed mansion now stands was once a different house by the same name? Built in 1878, Pierre Lorillard IV, who was among America's wealthiest men, had Peabody and Stearns design for him a rambling seaside cottage. It was among the largest and most expensive ever constructed in Newport, which is perhaps why Cornelius Vanderbilt II wanted to acquire it. The house changed hands in 1885, and it burned down just a few years later in 1892, being replaced by architect Richard Morris Hunt's version of the namesake, the Breakers. Even though Newport's coastline is still dotted by mansions of unimaginable scale, there were others that challenged the very notion of wealth, pushing the limits of what was possible, not just from a cost perspective, but from an engineering and architectural perspective, such as the summer cottage we are seeing now, which was known as Breakwater. But unfortunately, no amount of artisan work nor money will ensure a mansion remains standing. The Astor family would know that firsthand. Chetwode was one of Newport's most splendid Gilded Age villas, a lavish Louis XIV-style chateau designed by architect Horace Trumbauer for Mrs. William Storrs Wells. It featured formal gardens by Achille Duchesne and opulent interior reception rooms designed by Allard & Sons, all of which helped establish its reputation as an especially grand summer retreat on Bellevue Avenue. But it's the Astorlink that truly captured public curiosity. In 1934, ownership passed to John Jacob Astor VI, who simply went by Jakey and was often called the Titanic baby, whose mother Madeline survived the Titanic while 5 months pregnant with him. Jakey's father, Colonel John Jacob Astor IV, famously perished in the disaster. The Astors, long among America's wealthiest families, sometimes caused confusion with the repeated use of John Jacob and shifting Roman numerals, but Jakey's story was always distinct. His birth was steeped in drama and wrapped in a legacy of loss and heroism. Sadly, Chetwode's luxurious chapter came to an end after a catastrophic chimney fire in 1972, and the grand villa was razed the following year. Today it lives on in Newport lore and in the fascinating Astor family chronicles that continue to intrigue historians and visitors alike. Taking a stroll through Newport in those days would have been like traveling through a grand architectural exhibit. You could find houses in just about every style, some flamboyant and some reserved, but all of them incredibly well done. As the torch passed from one generation to another, what were once the largest and most elaborate mansions became viewed as outdated. Such was the case of Edgewater, which was later replaced by Ochre Court, one of the most impressive cottages that continues to stand. Though not all were lost to the idea of outdoing the neighbors, the Frank W. Andrews House was paved over for the U.S. Naval Station's expansion. And not all were lost to accidents either, some were maliciously disposed of. Greystone was among the most well-built homes, being constructed out of granite blocks in 1883. As it gracefully aged in place, it became a staple of the community's aesthetic of old money permanence, but that didn't stop an arson from damaging it beyond repair in 1938. Among the most tantalizing Italianates was Ladd Villa, which once again burned down under mysterious circumstances after being sold to developers who had already planned to build a neighborhood around it. Next, we'll make our way over to Linden Gate, the summer cottage of Henry Marquand, who was born into an incredibly wealthy family in the jewelry industry. He was heavily involved in the arts as a major supporter, giving unimaginable sums to museum and artists alike. Along the way, he collected more art than he knew what to do with, so when he hired Richard Morris Hunt to design Linden Gate, it was destined to house a small portion of his ever-growing art collection. The interior was designed by some of the most notable names from the period, including John Lafarge. And though there are very few photos of his time there, we can imagine how most of the rooms would have been overflowing with decor. Which brings us to the question, can you guess what happened to it in the early 1950s? If you said fire, you will be pleasantly surprised to know that it was actually broken up into apartments. The fire didn't take it out until 1973. Redevelopment happens so often that visitors to Gilded Age Newport might find themselves wondering where well-known landmarks went. One summer you could be enjoying the views of that year's fashionable architecture, and the next, the same lot could be refreshed beyond recognition. Mrs. Rebecca Jones' cottage was admittedly one of the more quaint cottages along Bellevue Avenue. Along with her next-door neighbor's house, the Coles cottage, the two lots created an ideal setting for a palace. Though the Jones lot was subdivided for another mansion's construction, both houses were torn down in preparation for Villa Rosa by the Morse family. Villa Rosa was among the flashiest mansions, being crowned by a copper dome, and under that dome you could find domed rooms glistening with gilded paneling and giant crystal chandeliers. Legend has it that the tax burden was simply too much for the owner to bear, which is reportedly why it was demolished in 1962. But backing up a few years and following the end of World War II, when the demand for housing was at a new peak, many of these homes were torn down and replaced by entire neighborhoods. This was the fate of Rockhurst, which stood from 1891 to 1955. Whitehall had a similar end, being replaced by a neighborhood in 1953. Some homes were torn down in anticipation of schools' expansions that never happened, with the W. Tucker House remaining an empty lot from 1938 to 2004. This was the story for quite a few cottages, as universities bought up mansions to use or replace with new buildings. Stoneacre had a good run, surviving all the way up until 1972, when it was demolished for the junior college, even though the plans for its replacement were ultimately abandoned. Though arguably, the cottage most mourned for its acquisition by a school was Whitehome. The site of Whitehome had been reimagined by architect John Russell Pope to unify an old house that had been renovated by Richard Morris Hunt. With Pope's vision completed in 1901, the mansion was given a breath of fresh air, with elegant gardens surrounding it on all sides. And with each turn around the property, each facade maintained the same iconic look, with proportions and architectural elements kept in perfect scale. Inside, you could find rooms clad in elaborate wood paneling with the most delicate of details carefully traced out by artists. Some rooms were outfitted with silk damask, while others contained visually captivating murals. These carefully crafted rooms were introduced to the Wrecking Ball in 1963 to make way for student housing. Over the decades, changing social taste, unpredictable economic forces, and the realities of upkeep have all played a role in reshaping Newport's skyline. While some of the Gilded Age's most iconic homes thankfully remain for us to admire, many spectacular estates have vanished as if they were never there, save for the stories, photos, and fragments of architectural salvage that remind us of their former glory. Despite their disappearance, these lost mansions remain an unforgettable part of Newport's narrative. They represent a turning point in American history, when industry boomed and fortunes soared, yet were also vulnerable to the forces of time and change. Looking back at the stories of these forgotten estates offers a window into the shifting cultural and economic tides that ultimately shaped the Newport we know today. And with that, I'll turn it over to you. What did you think about the lost cottages of Newport? Did any of them stick out to you? Let me know down below in the comments section, and while you're there, make sure you're subscribed so you never miss an exciting episode of This House.